a little bit about autism
hmm
and the different levels there are, or the different autism spectrum disorders, which is known
hmm
as ASD. What is autism?
Well, as you kind of touched on, it is a spectrum disorder. And what that means is there is different levels of assistance needed for each child who has it. My son happens to be on the low assistance side of the spectrum, which was previously known as high functioning. So he is vocal, he's verbal. He does okay with social interactions. They can be a little challenging for him. He can maintain eye contact, which is something a lot of children with autism kind of struggle with, especially those on the side of the spectrum who need higher assistance. Um, but the way it was explained to me by his doctors is it's kind of a social functioning disorder. There's nothing wrong with their brains necessarily. It just works in a different way, and it can present a lot of challenges socially, particularly. So there is a range of how it affects kids, even children who are on the same side of the spectrum. They can have different challenges that they face or different symptoms that they show.
Mm-hmm.
In my son's case, he struggles a lot with textures, touches.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't like certain things on his skin. He doesn't like certain things in his mouth. He really struggles with how things feel, very sensory. He does struggle a little bit socially. He is challenged somewhat in reading nonverbal cues.
Okay.
He sometimes thinks I'm sad when I'm not, or sometimes doesn't pick up when I'm angry. And I have to say, I'm very angry right now. Yeah. And it manifested a lot when he was littler. Unfortunately, he would think that kids were friends with him when they weren't, when in fact they were actually kind of teasing him or making fun of him or just kind of weirded out by him.
Yeah.
It's he can come on a little strong at times, and that's just part of this disorder. Is he doesn't look at social interactions the way you or I would. He
Yes.
sees it through a different filter.
Yeah. Once represented a gentleman who had autism but didn't get diagnosed until he was, I think, 45 years old.
Just being really, I think, understanding, knowing that it's not a mental deficit. It's not something that, they don't understand the world around them, or they don't see the world around them or interact with it. They do, just in a different way. And to be respectful of that and not see it necessarily as a disability, but just a different perspective is something that I think is really helpful when you, especially if you aren't very familiar, if you haven't been around somebody with autism before, to just, take a step back and understand that, okay, this is still a person. This is a regular person who just happens to see the world differently. And, may need different accommodations. A friend of mine has a child on the spectrum who is more high needs. He is nonverbal, and he does wonderfully with the assistance of his little speaking board. He has this board that he can use to communicate because he can't verbalize the way most people would.
Yes.
But he's still an amazing kid who has his own interests and his own dreams and his own joys.
Right.
He just expresses them differently.
Yes. I've heard this, and please correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm spreading misinformation, but children with autism, or they're more sensitive or more emotional in a way. How do they typically handle emotions?
Well, I can't speak to every child with autism. Kids with autism are different the way any kid is. Kids handle things differently. I will say from my son, I have seen that to be accurate. And that's where I think a lot of what people term meltdowns come from. It's just him having all of these emotions and not really knowing how to process them. And they just come bursting out of him. And he struggled with that a lot when he was younger. I don't know how many times I had to leave a restaurant or the grocery store, or even something fun like a party or a play date, because he just had more going on in his system than he could process, and he was overwhelmed. And the only way he knew how to express that was by screaming and, throwing what could be perceived as a fit, but really it's just him saying, you know what, I've hit my wall. That's all I can take.
Yes.
But I do think, he feels things very, very deeply. And it can just come out sideways sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. And I think it's important for us to understand that. Now, as far as awareness, before we touch on awareness, do you think there's ever a cause to someone having autism, or is it
No.
Okay.
No, actually, when my son was diagnosed, his doctors went through that with us and said, look, we haven't nailed down what quote unquote causes autism. We don't know if it's genetically linked to one parent or another. We don't know if it runs in families. It definitely is not caused by vaccines. That has been disproven. I know that's a common misconception. But no, they haven't really identified what causes autism. It's just their brains are wired a little bit differently.
Do you think that a lot is being done to not only spread awareness of autism, but to help and progress?
I do think that there has been a lot of progress made in the past, even 10 years. You and I had a conversation about this previously, and I mentioned that we had known that something was different about our son since he was probably 4 years old. And we went through a lot of different psychologists and psychiatrists and child play therapists. And we, received a diagnosis of ADHD, which does share some similarities, especially in children who are more high functioning, shares some similarities with ASD. Mm-hmm. But we knew that there was something more going on. And just the change in the past 10 years, I think, is what allowed us to finally get the diagnosis that he needed at age 14, because that perception, not only within the general community, but within the medical community, has changed. There's no more Asperger's. There's no more just straight autism. Recognizing, I think, that it is a spectrum, and doing away with Asperger's and wrapping it into the whole of the spectrum disorder has made a huge difference. It's allowed people who previously didn't understand the differences about them to get that diagnosis and receive the tools that they need. To that end, I think that society itself has begun to develop a lot of those tools because of a better understanding of what ASD is. Yes. Schools have become more accommodating, and society has become more understanding. I think that there's still room for improvement, but there always will be. So.
As long as they're progressing and it's just getting better.
Yes.
Pray that it always gets better, especially in schools, because I do think that young children, maybe under 21, struggle with it the most, whereas adults tend to cope with it a little bit better and tend to know how to navigate it a little bit better than young children.
I absolutely agree. Even with my son's case, he's 14 and he already has developed certain coping mechanisms to live life in a different way than he did when he was 4 or 6 or 8 years old, and really struggling with, how do I manage my own feelings and how do I recognize feelings in others? He's come up with ways to recognize, oh, that person is sad and I need to do X, Y, or Z, or, oh, that person is, needing a little quiet time and I need to give them space. Whereas that was something he really struggled with when he was a child. I think that the younger children, they need those tools and the assistance to develop those coping skills. Whereas people who have made it to their teenage years or adulthood may have already developed some coping skills on their own. Now, that's not to say that, those coping skills are all they need. They may need better coping skills or different coping skills, but they've found a way to exist within the world that is not really built for them. So
I agree.
Yeah.
Do you think that there are appropriate or inappropriate or insensitive ways to describe someone who may have autism?
There are some obvious ways that you don't want to describe a child with autism. You don't want to say slow or mentally challenged or something like that, because they're not. They're often actually really advanced in intelligence. They just, may not perceive social interaction the way most people would. And that can come off as a little bit awkward or uh, different, but that doesn't mean that they are inferior or less intelligent.
Right.
So I think just, polite ways would be, person first wording, a child with autism as opposed to an autistic child, or a person with autism as opposed to an autistic person. Not that it's offensive necessarily to say an autistic child. It's just, I think, more polite to put the person first ahead of the disorder.
I love that. I love that. And that's why I'm so careful, and I'm even stumbling on words because I'm like, I don't want to say anything that can be insensitive. So,
Well,
yes,
I'm the mother of a boy with autism, and I still say autistic child sometimes. So.
Yeah, meaning, you're their parent, and I completely understand. And I do feel that that's the way it should be looked at. A child with autism and not an autistic child, because in a way it can seem like you're just labeling him and throwing him and her away. So I completely agree with that. Is there any more information you would like to spread about autism and bring any kind of awareness?
The only thing that I would really like to say is, to parents who have been concerned that their child may need an additional diagnosis, whether they think that it's autism or not, don't give up on that. Trust your gut, and really, if a doctor says no and you really disagree with that, then seek out a second opinion. It took us 8 years to get my son diagnosed with autism, even though we knew that there was something more than his ADHD going on. But I don't know how many medical or psychological professionals told us, no, it's just the ADHD. He's just presenting in a weird way. And it's like, no, he does have ADHD. He absolutely does, but he also has autism. And those two diagnoses require different accommodations. So, moms know best, and trust your gut.
Right.
I would say document your concerns, definitely. You spend way more time with your child than any medical professional is going to. You spend more time with your child than a daycare provider or a teacher is going to. So they may not see everything that you see. If you notice something repetitively cropping up with your child, then make a note of it and take those concerns to a professional. That's what I did with my son. Is I would write down things like, he hates to wear jeans and he will pitch a fit if I forced him into denim of any kind. Or he does this really fun ticking thing when he plays video games or gets excited. He'll like tick his fingers. And I took a video of that and I showed it to the doctors, and I said, this is something he doesn't do often. This is something his teachers aren't seeing, but it happens all the time. So just having those documentations and those specific examples to hold up to the medical professional can really assist in their diagnosis.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for parents who may suspect their child has autism?
As far as getting them diagnosed, starting with your pediatrician and expressing your concerns, getting a referral to somebody who specializes in autism. Here in Kansas City, we have the University of Kansas Hospital and Children's Mercy both have wonderful autism departments. And so we got a referral to both of them because it can take a while to get in to be seen, just because there is kind of a high demand and so few specialists. So starting with your pediatrician and getting that referral to those people who really specialize in autism, that's where to start. And you don't know how the evaluation will turn out. It may turn out that they come back to you and say, nope, not autism, but we think X, Y, and Z might be going on. Or yes, autism, and here's where they rate within the spectrum, and here's what you should anticipate. I walked out of that evaluation with a folder probably 2 inches thick of information and resources and support groups. And you're never alone in a diagnosis, no matter what it is. Yeah. There's going to be resources and supports. So don't be afraid to pursue that and to get your child the help that they need.
Yes.
And, it's not something that you want to throw the label at every little issue you see. And I know that some parents are concerned that there might be overdiagnosis of certain issues, not just autism, but ADHD. I know I've heard plenty of people say, oh my gosh, it's such an overdiagnosed disorder. But that doesn't mean it's not a disorder. That doesn't mean that your child may not have it. And fearing ridicule for that label or fearing the label itself isn't going to get your child the help that they may need in order to function or to succeed in school, in relationships, in their social lives. There are organizations that we've been referred to who can help with life skills, who will help with job hunts when he does get older, or who will help them apply for benefits if they're not able to work. I mean, it's a recognized disability, actually, by the government. Autism is a recognized disability. So there are plenty of resources, I think, already that exist for individuals who need the assistance. And not every individual who has autism will require those programs, but they do exist. And I know that as understanding and supportive as schools are, I think most workplaces are similar. You know, if you have a disability, they're going to accommodate you, whether it's because you're a paraplegic or because you have autism. I mean, both conditions would require certain accommodations, but it doesn't mean that the individual is incapable of doing the job.
Exactly.